For me, it's more about reading the technologies that are around at the moment.
I'm a bit skeptic.
Often when you do a lot of futures visioning workshops, people fall back to your Mad Max dystopia when they're trying to find the idea of the future, right? Mm-hmm. You know, this sounds cliched and corny, but Black Panther, I think, it certainly got me to think about this idea of different visions and whose narrative and trope gets to determine those visions. Yeah. So I've loved seeing the advent of Afrofuturism come out. And I think that's really, really awesome because it's not the stories you often hear. And it also draws on cultural and indigenous, people's own cultural and indigenous history to form this sort of vision or story or speculation of the future, and that I think we ought to have a lot more of.
I don't know, I haven't seen any movies necessarily around this. That's not to say that there aren't any, I just haven't really seen any. For me, it's more about reading the technologies that are around at the moment. And so there's been a company called Newton out of the States for probably the last 5 or 6 years that have been getting better at adaptive learning. Yeah. And knowing sort of training and education the way I do and knowing the consumer, you can sort of triangulate to go, that's just going to be a far superior way of doing things. Yeah. And what, particularly as the tech continues to improve, it will be cheap and it will be really effective, and it's like tailoring en masse. And so you go, okay, that's probably going to be built in. And then you go, okay, well, how is AI going to play a part? And it's like everybody wants a personalized coach. Everybody wants a personalized teacher. Okay, well, AI will be able to do that in about 5 years.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is an awesome concept, and I can't think of any movies. You know, when I think of education in sci-fi movies,
we should make one.
Totally. And I'm like a total sci-fi geek, and I think, you know, when you think about education, you know, in sci-fi movies and stuff, you think about things like The Matrix, where things are just uploaded into your brain, knowledge, but that's just like another form of chalk and talk in a way. You know, it's just like rote learning, imprinting, and what you're talking about feels to me more like elevating human potential on a really individual level.
Yes.
Yeah. They're totally
That's
different
the
things.
only way to elevate human potential, because you can't do it en masse. You have to start with the individual. And what technology enables us to do is tailor learning to every individual at scale. And so they're kind of two juxtaposing forces. Like, you can produce it at scale, but it's highly individual. Thanks to technology, yes.
So sci-fi, you know, flying cars, we've been talking about that since
Back to the Future.
Early, the 1940s, 1950s. Yeah. The Jetsons, and it's still not there yet. So, there are experiments there with people, you know, experimenting with things in their brain, digital technology and humans and technology.
But we also know, you brought up the big 5 tech companies, and we know that a lot of the decision makers at these companies have, you know, kind of visions of the future that are not, you know, based in science. They're based on, you know, projections about what the world might be, you know, so that informs behavior to some extent, doesn't it?
I'm a bit skeptic. I think human beings, same with digital technology, you know, we think we're going to connect more and everything will be digital, but then you see people bounce back where they say, no, let's switch everything off. And I sometimes use the analogy of the electric knife. So in the 1960s and 70s, everything got electrified. And the electric knife was, of course, you know, why would you do this manually if you can have an electric knife? And there were all kitchen appliance companies made electric knives, and yes, there might be a few professional kitchen people still use it for this stuff, but who has an electric knife these days? And I think many of the things we hear just might be electric knives.
Most of the speculative fiction is very fantastical, right? But that's the point, right? It's supposed to inspire your imagination about what might be possible. And even though it might be a little bit speculative and fantastical in a sense, that's great, because that does make your mind think in different ways. And so some of the classics of the genre, you know, they're classics because they're really great. You know, H.G. Wells is wonderful, and you know, classic movies like Back to the Future, who, you know, they spend a lot of effort to make sure that their kind of logical thought processes were sound. You know, and then it's up to a certain point, and then go into the more speculative stuff. Movies like Interstellar, in fact, I quite like a lot because they consulted with experts in the field to make sure that the simulations that they were using were accurate to some extent. And some of those are really good, but of course, at all of them, you get to the point where then the physics turns into, it's no longer physics fact, it's physics, extrapolation. And it's kind of the curse of being a physicist in a way, right? Where you're following along with some really nice movie, and then they just get to the point where you're like, oh, that could never happen. Even though you want to be a good sport, you're like, yeah, this is great. You're like, oh man, come on. That's one of the reasons why, say 2001 is still such a classic. It's a brilliant masterpiece film, right? And it's never let you down as a physicist, because you're like, okay, maybe if you see a gigantic obelisk in space, that's not going to work so well. But like the fact that there's no sound in space, you're like, this is great. They got it right.